Rwanda is a unique nation. Today its population is around 10 to 12 million people. It's the most densely populated country in Africa. It's tiny, it's landlocked, and most maps in fact print its name outside the borders for legibility. It's one of the only countries in Africa that has a unified culture and one single African language, Kinyarwanda, which is one of the languages in Africa spoken by the highest number of people. It's a beautiful, mountainous country, the land of 1,000 hills. It's on the equator, it receives year-round rain. It grows just about every kind of crop. It's a land of extremes. It has some of the tallest people on earth and some of the shortest people. But most extreme of all, it's now sadly synonymous with the genocide of 1994. In just 100 days, between April the 6th and July the 4th, 1994, up to 1 million people were killed. At the time, its population was 8 million, so it was literally decimated. People killed in their homes, in the streets, in churches, in just about every part of the land. Meanwhile, the international community debated what to do. The current President of Rwanda, Paul Kagame, says that the world stood around with its hands in its pockets. I don't want to tell the story here of the genocide. It's not my place to do that, and it's complex. But surely, if ever there was, this was hell on earth. It's an horrible evidence of the inhumanity of man, one to another, and the wounds are still deep and real in the country. And yet, there has been repentance, there is reconciliation, and there are amazing stories of healing and forgiveness. General Dallaire, who was a Canadian, one of the leaders of the UN peacekeeping force, in his memoirs he called it shaking hands with the devil. He wrote, "I now believe in God because in Rwanda I saw the devil. I shook hands with the devil." And the genocide really was a picture of evil unleashed. I've been to Normandy's war cemeteries in northern France, tens of thousands of gleaming white crosses placed with military precision in manicured lawns in beautifully kept graveyards. Somehow in the order and the peace of the graveyards, you can almost miss the horrible, gruesome ways they died in the trenches. The cemeteries I've visited in Rwanda are very different. There's an earthy way. They are just there in rural areas right next to a village. And we're going to one memorial garden. There's a mud road running past. The red dust of the road coated the wooden crosses. Small crosses placed seemingly haphazard, anonymous across the hillside. Thousands and thousands of crosses. And just outside the gates of the memorial garden, children playing boisterously in the road, banana trees growing around the graves, and a village right next door to it. Life right next door to death. A stark juxtaposition. From there, we drove to another village, Nyamata, where there is a mud brick church which was left as it was found after the genocide. It's believed that some 5,000 people were slaughtered within the walls of the church. They had sought sanctuary there and they were massacred together. And when you walk in to the church, it's overwhelming. Bones, skulls, a riotous debris, books, prayer hymnals, overturned benches, items of clothing, odd shoes, broken combs, small shattered mirrors lying on the ground. It's overwhelming. And there, at the front of the church, a simple wooden pulpit with an earthen chalice. And someone has placed a skull on the pulpit, staring out almost accusingly. It's a stark and shocking memorial. I first visited Rwanda in 2002 and went back several times over the years since then. It's a place that I've learnt to love. I love my friends there who are serving selflessly. I think of the leader in the country there. She told me that in her first years in Rwanda, she had a ministry of tears, sitting with widows, listening to their stories, hardly able to say anything, just crying with them, grieving with those who grieve, helping people talk and work through the long process of grieving. Other people told me some of their stories. I remember sitting with one of the students that I was teaching. His name, I'll call him Alan. He was in his mid-20s at the time. He had actually grown up in one of the refugee camps in Uganda that I had visited some 10 years earlier. I knew the place where he had grown up. He'd grown up as a long-term refugee in another country, longing to be home, hearing the stories from his family of Rwanda on the other side of the mountains. Sadly, his family were killed in the camp. He fled the violence into the bush. At that point, I think he said he was 8 years old. Living in the bush in Uganda, he got caught up in the civil war. He joined a group of soldiers who were living in the bush, Museveni's men. And he fought with them as a child soldier until Museveni came to power in Uganda in the mid-80s. And then Alan found himself living on the streets in Kampala, the capital. He took up with a group of Rastas and lived off his wits, living on the streets of Kampala. And then in his mid-teens, he met some other Rwandese people who were part of the RPF, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, refugees in exile fighting for their land. And Alan took up with this group and spent the next several years trying to win back his country. He was in the army during the genocide, invading from the Ugandan side, pushing through Rwanda until they took the capital of Kigali, which really marked the end of the genocide. Alan stayed in the army for several years after the genocide was finished. He was fighting in the DRC. He actually came to faith in the Congo, returned to Kigali, living there, and I met him in his mid-20s, 2 or 3 years after he'd come to faith. By this point, he was working with orphans orphaned by AIDS. He was working with widows left from the genocide. It was amazing to hear his story, how for 2 decades he had experienced just about every conceivable nightmare, constant ungrace. And yet somehow the cycle of ungrace had been broken. The abused was not becoming the abuser. Now he was part of the solution. He had discovered grace and a measure of healing, and he was reaching out to those around him. After talking to Alan, I sat at the evening meal surrounded by the students, the noise of the frogs and the mosquitoes and the dogs barking outside. And I got talking to Jane. Again, that's not her name. She was the same age as me. She also grew up in exile in Burundi. She was abandoned when she was very young by her father. She told me stories of abuse at the hands of her school teachers, of being abandoned by her boyfriend when he discovered that she was pregnant, of returning to Rwanda from Burundi when she was a young adult, of being imprisoned there, accused of being a Burundian spy, of 3 months in prison, realizing that no one on earth knew that she was there. And in her distress, she cried out to God and said, "If you're there, I need you." She told me that she heard an audible voice, "I love you, and you'll serve me." When she was released from prison, she lived through the worst days of the genocide. She had miraculous stories of surviving several near-death experiences. She showed me scars on her legs and her arms from grenades. She told me of one time when she was with a group who were all killed in front of her eyes, and strangely, mysteriously, a complete stranger who was one of the killers said, "Not her, and let her go. She had no idea why. And here she was, years after the genocide, living in a Christian community with other people, choosing the painful road of recovery. She was being challenged daily, she told me, to forgive, to choose to forgive and not to be angry. And in the years after the genocide, she forgave her father, she forgave her school teachers, she forgave the men in the prison. And then one day she was challenged she needed to forgive her boyfriend, the father of her child. She told me that this was hard. She didn't know if she could do it. And then one day, completely unexpectedly, she bumped into him on the streets of Kigali. She hadn't seen him for many years. She somehow found the courage to speak to him. She told him that she'd come to faith, she was following Jesus, and that she wanted to forgive him for abandoning her. And she told me that as she was taking these steps to extend grace to other people, she was finding it easier to forget, easier to move on, easier to put the past behind her. As she was forgiving, she was recognizing that she was forgiven and she was being healed through the act of forgiveness. After this long conversation with Jane, I returned to my bedroom. I had several books with me. I've got many books on the story of the genocide written from several different angles. I was reading General Delaire's book. I was reading another book about the betrayal of Rwanda by the West. I was reading of Rwanda lying on the fault line between Francophone and Anglophone Africa and the French involvement in training and arming the Rwandan government in the years leading up to the genocide. I read about the UN Secretary General, Boutros Boutros-Ghali, brokering a huge arms deal between his country, Egypt, and Rwanda in 1991, and how Egypt continued to supply arms to the Rwandan government during the genocide. Meanwhile, Boutros Boutros-Ghali was advising the UN not to get involved. I read about the US and Britain, my country, permanent members on the UN Security Council vetoing the desires of other UN nations to get involved and to intervene. America said they had no national interests in Rwanda. And both countries refused to use the word genocide, as that gave them a moral and a legal obligation to intervene. Meanwhile, 1 million people were killed. And in 2003, on my second visit to Rwanda, it was at the time of the Iraq War, and I watched with shock and shame as I saw the way Britain and America raced to invade Iraq, and saw the cowardly way they both refused to get involved in Rwanda just 10 years earlier. I was ashamed. And as I read stories like this, and saw the betrayal of Rwanda by the West, but also saw the inhumanity of one Rwandese to another in the country, and heard the stories from people like Jane and Alan, I saw just one almost continual cycle of disgrace, ungrace, horrible stories. To his credit, Bill Clinton later visited Rwanda and apologised. This actually was very significant. I heard stories from several Rwandese who said how significant it was that a world politician came and owned up to a mistake. It's relatively rare, isn't it, for our politicians to own their mistakes, so that was very significant. And yet, the story runs deep. And I sat there in my room pondering some of these things. Outside, I could hear the students singing. Beautiful voices, haunting melodies and harmonies. And I went and stood in my door and watched. And outside in the dark, under the stars, I saw Jane dancing with another man, one of the students. And they were dancing in a traditional Rwandese, I think it's like a cattle dance. They're dancing like the cattle herders with their long sticks, long arms, long legs, and it's a beautiful, swaying, rhythmic dance. And they were singing Amazing Grace. How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. In that same year, 2002, I'd been in Mozambique, walking in a swamp, and I told this story in another place of seeing a lily in the swamp, and later reading a couplet from George Herbert's poem where he says, "And here in dust and dirt, oh here the lilies of his love appear." And there in Rwanda, I saw that. In the dust and the dirt and the ugliness, the disgrace of what humans have done to other humans, I saw the lilies of God's love. I saw grace. And as I listened to Jane singing Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound, I thought, I know hardly anything about grace. When I look at this young woman and I hear her stories, and I look at how she is choosing to forgive, how she's choosing to extend grace, and how she's finding healing. When I heard my friend, the leader, saying that she had a ministry of tears, sitting with the widows, mourning with them, crying with those who mourn, crying with those who are crying. When I saw people committed to rebuilding the nation, to seeking reconciliation. When sin abounds, grace abounds all the more. And that's a beautiful truth. I pray that we never see situations like this again. And yet somehow you recognise that in this human, broken, fallen world, disgrace continues. And yet God's grace is there, healing, restoring, reconciling, and giving people the power to reach out and forgive and extend grace. And just as they've received grace, they extend grace to others. And these people, Jane, Alan, they are the real heroes of our faith.